Hello, everyone. We are the UN High-Level Climate Action Champions for the upcoming COP26 negotiation in Glasgow at the end of this year. Our role was born out of the Paris Climate Agreement back in 2015, in an explicit recognition of the importance that all actors, not just governments, have in driving and enabling the transition to a zero emissions and resilient world. At the end, it means that we are all responsible for galvanizing action from not only, as I said, the states members, but also companies, cities, state regions, investors, civil society, all applying for positive pressure on governments to help them step up. We call this the ambition loop, where governments push other actors to go even further on the pledges that have made, and vice versa. Today, we have been invited to talk to you about how to raise the ambition and create new commitments as a community. Because after all, the transition is going to take us, all of us. We therefore have several values we would like now to share with you on how to do this.
Great, thanks, Gonzalo. The first value we'd like to share with you is that we have to signal urgency. The biggest barrier we face in achieving zero emissions is not denial, it's delay. We all know that it's far easier and cheaper to tackle systemic risks up front, to prevent problems rather than to solve them, and to mitigate the worst impacts rather than to wish them away. And we also know that right now, other economic, health, and societal issues in the world mean that acting on climate change can sometimes and somehow feel like a second-tier priority. But the science is crystal clear. We have to halve our emissions by 2030. That's an urgent and rapid scale of change if we are to stay within striking distance of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. And we know that that's what we have to do to be on our way to a healthier, safer, cleaner world. So that it's not about grand statements of ambition for later. It's about action today, right now, and the years in front of us. We won't reach emissions in time if we don't start moving today, as a central part of our recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. The Paris Agreement sets the final destination, and that we have to define these 5-year ratcheted goals starting in 2020, and then take a pit stop, reflect on progress, and ratchet again. So we need to signal urgency from everybody, every community, every corner of society, every business, every city, because we can't be late in the short term if we want to deliver on the long-term promise of Paris.
Thank you, Nigel. Our value number 2 is about momentum. Since the World Environmental Day last year, nearly 3,500 companies, cities, states, regions, and universities have now joined the Race to Zero campaign, the largest ever alliance of non-state actors galvanizing to deliver the promise of the Paris Agreement. And despite the COVID-19 pandemic, 2,162 companies, 509 cities, 23 regions, 127 investors, and 571 universities have now made a credible climate change commitments to reach net zero emissions before 2050 with robust 2030 interim targets. So overall, the Race to Zero campaign has grown by 72% since we launched it last year, and by 20% only in the last month, as more and more companies realize the business case for the transition for a zero carbon economy. We call this phenomenon FOMO, the fear of missing out, when individual actors don't want to be left behind in this irresistible drive towards a zero carbon economy that is now absolutely inevitable. Our collective momentum is growing and it's gathering pace.
Thanks, Gonzalo. Well, as we said before, it's not enough just to commit. This has to be about action. So great, we have a sense of FOMO, fear of missing out, and more people are committing to net zero. But that brings us to value 3. we go from the commitment to the action, and that's about integrity. So value 3, integrity is everything, because with this proliferation of commitments, we see increased instances of greenwashing, where a company says it's committed but doesn't turn that into action, or a city mayor says they're going to get to net zero but doesn't put in place the policies to deliver in the next 5 years. So if we're really going to raise that ambition and turn it into action, credibility has to be a guiding principle. Take the concept of net zero. We've recently seen a report by Friends of the Earth showing that some powerful actors are using net zero pledges to hide their climate inaction. And you couple that with a concern that setting a distant, ambitious sounding target means that companies and cities are not doing enough now. Again, early credible action is the key. That's why we're linking this clarity and sense of urgency with a call for tighter standards. Within 6 months to go before COP26, we've been working with all the partners in the Race to Zero to refine the criteria with partner initiatives, whether it's the business ambition for 1.5 or the climate pledge or the city's Race to Zero. And we have a rigorous application process and an independent expert peer review group to ensure those standards are adhered to. Those criteria outline the minimum standards for businesses, investors, cities, regions, and universities, so that when they say they're in the Race to Zero, everyone can be confident they've got robust and credible commitments. That means a stronger emphasis on the need for clear interim targets and a focus on action, and more specificity about the language of residual emissions and offsets, and absolute clarity on the need for annual reporting on progress. By ensuring credibility, we're aiming to make sure that the Race to Zero promotes learning and upwards convergence to a race to the top, as we sometimes say, around actors setting net zero target. Ultimately, it's that integrity that will help catalyze actors to come up to the frontier of best practices. And of course, these are all voluntary commitments, and they need to be matched through that ambition loop that Gonzalo described with the regulations which will reward leaders and force the laggards to join the Race to Zero over time, driving that ambition loop. Back to you, Gonzalo.
And those values that Nigel's referring to are even more important in this year, and takes us to our value 4, that is about recovering from COVID. As we know that climate commitments have doubled during the global pandemic, and many have made a strong case for a green recovery from coronavirus. Governments can and should support their ambition by setting the right recovery and the structural frameworks for a fast but managed low carbon transition. The pandemic has revealed that our systems are not fit for purpose. We have failed, and we can now see the weak points in public health systems and global supply chains and industries. We now have the unique opportunity and the duty to address those weaknesses of the past so we can be better prepared for future shocks that we know will come. As we rebuild by investing in infrastructure and jobs, we must choose the greener path that will help build the resilience against the impact of climate change. Doing so will not only ensure a more resilient recovery, but also make the air in our cities cleaner, which in turn will help prevent millions of early deaths and definitely protect nature and biodiversity for the generations to come.
Thanks, Gonzalo. And finally, money. Value 5, it's about shifting the trillions. Trillions is a lot of money. A trillion is 1,000 billion or 1,000 million or 10, with 12 zeros. It's a huge amount of money. Underpinning this whole transition is finance, investment in the transition. We're already seeing a fundamental shift in capital accelerating as the world's larger asset owners, managers, banks and insurers are committing to zero and driving that transition. But we're going to need to see that really ramp up to ensure we reach that more resilient and inclusive zero carbon economy. 90 central banks have joined the network for the greening the financial system, and increasingly concerned about the financial stability risks if we don't tackle climate change. And 92% of business leaders saying that banks are applying significant pressure on them to act sustainably. That's only going to ramp up in the months to come as we see the latest scientific reports later in the year. To mark President Biden's climate summit, over 160 firms, together managing $70 trillion of assets, formed the largest ever financial alliance in history dedicated to rapidly driving down emissions. It's called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and that, we think, represents a major inflection point for raising ambition. That means that the financial institutions who own and lend money to companies are going to be expecting them and financing them to drive the sectoral decarbonisation. And they're going to have to, after making that commitment as part of the Race to Zero, publish their own plans of how they're going to shift their business models to support the decarbonisation of the global economy, to drive that 50% reduction we talked about at the beginning. And we need finance fundamentally for three things. We need finance to speed up the innovation at the early stage in industries like green hydrogen. We need it to scale up the pace of deployment of solutions that are already mature, like electric vehicles, renewable energy, and battery storage. And we also need it to find the way to support the resilient solutions needed around the world to prevent the worst of climate change. This shift in capital is more evidence that sustainable investments are going to deliver better returns to investors, given there won't be any companies whose business models aren't profoundly affected by net zero, because policy and regulation and changing customer preferences are also going to be changing to drive that ambition loop. It's clear the winds have shifted. Financiers are going to be the new activists putting sustainability at the heart of how they operate, and we're going to need that to shift from billions to trillions, driving the race to zero.
Well, what all these values need is pragmatical imagination. It's a combination of action and solidarity, because we must reimagine the challenge. It's not about burden sharing, but opportunity sharing. By committing to work together in a spirit of what we call radical collaboration, all countries, governments, businesses, and civil society can and must lay the foundation for faster, robust progress in the decade to come. Thank you very much.